Loudspeaker Studios. Ladies and gentlemen and Tromavilians, welcome to the new episode of Talkin' Troma with me, Zach Bynes. And this is a very exciting episode. In the history of Troma, Lloyd Kaufman has had several books that were all ghostwritten by someone, but right now we actually have the author of a brand new Troma book. Lloyd has not written this one at all, so you know it's going to be a good one. May you introduce yourself, please, sir?
Yes, I am not Lloyd Kaufman, but Mathew Klickstein.
Thank you for coming on, Mathew. This is a pretty funny roundabout small world situation. So Lloyd texted me. He's like, Zach, you need to get Mathew on Talkin' Troma to talk about my new book. And so we were texting back and forth. And I was, going to do it the old fashioned way over Zoom or whatever. And you're like, hey, I noticed you have a Colorado number. And I was like, yeah, I'm down here in Denver, but we record in Fort Collins. You're like, oh, that's crazy. I live in Greeley now. And then I was like, my producer, Chris, lives in Greeley and comes down to Fort Collins.
Yeah, no, it's a wild coincidence, but I have spent a lot of time here where we are right now and do a lot with the really amazing art house cinema and culture space that they have here over by Colorado State University, the Lyric. And, that was what really caught my attention. Oh, Fort Collins, I do stuff at the Lyric all the time. And then when it turned out that Chris lives in Greeley, I mean, that was just such a wild coincidence. I'm still telling people about that all the time because even how I got to Greeley is pretty random. I've lived in the Boulder, Longmont area on and off since 2010. I leave, I come back, I leave, I come back. This is the first time I'm living in Greeley, though. About a year ago, I took over as the publication director, helping to run Greeley Lifestyle Magazine. But it really is this tiny, small, little random town. Probably its most well-known representation is being made fun of in an entire episode of South Park many years ago. But it is where University of Northern Colorado is, and it's a cool little town. But yes, how random that you guys
it is a
this.
small town.
Yeah.
Like
it's very small and it's very random.
If you're not from Colorado, there's a good chance you might not have even heard of Greeley.
No, there's another person I'm working with on a different project right now who's an older gentleman on the West Coast, is a political commentator. I'm helping him write his book, and he was telling me about his mom when we first were talking over the phone. He said, oh, she grew up in a small northern Colorado town you've never heard of before called Greeley. So yeah, you never know. It is the fastest growing community in the state, though, and one of the fastest in the country. So hey, who knows?
The big joke in Denver is if you go outside and it smells like Greeley, which means it smells like cow poop, it's going to snow. So it's a really small world that there's, in northern Colorado, there is a hive of Troma activity. It's just weird. Your book, Lloyd Kaufman Interviews, it's not your first book that you've written. You've written a few more, which I thought was really cool. Given the subject matter of your other books, and then leading into the Lloyd Kaufman one, you wrote Slimed, the history of Nickelodeon, and you wrote a book about The Simpsons as well with Mike Reese, one of the longtime Simpsons guys, like from the beginning.
Yep.
So tell us a little bit about those couple things before we really dive into the Troma stuff.
I think it actually all makes a lot of sense. And I don't think too many people are that surprised that I ended up working on a book about Troma and Lloyd. And in fact, over the last few years, just because Lloyd has been around so long and has been involved in so many different things as we get into in the book, I've been able to, sneak, if you want to call it that, but I've been able to get Lloyd into almost every book I've done for the last few projects. As an example, I just did the Comic-Con oral history with Fantagraphics a couple years ago, and the podcast series with SiriusXM, and we talked to, both for the podcast series and the book, Lloyd, because obviously Troma and Lloyd were a big part of the earlier years of San Diego Comic-Con. I mean, he still goes every year now, but he was one of the first big, if you want to call them that, film studios, if you will, that were there at Comic-Con in the 80s and that kind of thing. So I've always been able to find a way to get Lloyd in there. In fact, when we were working on the Mark Summers documentary project, we even had Lloyd do a video about the slime from Troma, the slime from Mark Summers. So because Lloyd and I have been good friends for more than half my life now, and I've always been a big Troma acolyte since I was a kid, and I just love Lloyd and look up to him like a lot of people see him as a bit of a mentor. And he's, of course, always great for an interview. I've always found a way to involve him. And in fact, Mike Reese from The Simpsons, one of two people who's written for the show since it started. He's a big Troma fan. He loves Lloyd. I think they know each other. I'm not sure. They're both New York guys. Lloyd fits right into my oeuvre, if you will, because I'm always doing these kind of pop culture history projects, especially a lot of projects that are focused on the 80s and 90s, and Troma and Lloyd falls right in there.
It's just so cool to see. Because you could, like, as a Troma fan, you definitely see the natural progressions, like Nickelodeon, Simpsons, Troma. And you said you grew up as a young boy loving Troma. What was your first exposure to Troma?
I think like a lot of people from our generation, 80s and early 90s kids, I grew up, especially being a West Coast guy, I grew up on USA Up All Night with Rhonda and Joe Bob Briggs, drive-in theater, and what we colorfully called then, and I still do, Skinamax. It was just a matter of we were a bunch of precocious preteen and teenage boys and sometimes gals that loved watching things that we weren't supposed to watch very clearly. And there was nothing that was more irreverent and out there and vulgar and offensive for a bunch of kids that were already growing up on Ren and Stimpy and Beavis and Butthead and The Simpsons early on, like Troma. We loved our John Waters and we loved our John Carpenters and we loved our crazy horror films and movies like that. But, we couldn't get enough of Troma, and we would watch them on USA Up All Night and Joe Bob Briggs and Skinamax. And we were also all video store kids. So we'd hang out at the video stores and we would watch the movies that, the crazy kind of comic book store type guys at the video stores would give us to watch, probably thinking that it was funny to give them to a bunch of 11-year-old or 12-year-old kids. And of course, the posters and the boxes were very eye-catching. We grew up on that stuff, and I loved the Toxic Avenger as a kid. And of course, I'm wearing the hat right now. Lloyd gave it to me actually one of the last times I saw him. Toxic Crusaders. I mean, I love the Toxic Crusaders. I was all in. I had the action figures. I would always watch the show. Troma was a big part of my childhood for sure.
It definitely comes across not only like you grew up with Troma, but what I really like about the book is you put the respect that Troma deserves. Part of the reason I decided to do this show was I got tired of reading the backhanded compliment that Troma got and not getting the praise that it did. And just from the introduction of your book alone, it goes into an academic world, which is incredible. If this book came out when I was in film school, I'm pretty sure I could have convinced, the dean of the school to have allowed my class credits for Poultrygeist to go through, even though I was like the head of a department on a 35 millimeter film, because it's a Troma movie and he didn't like Troma. But I feel like this book is going to change the way a lot of people view Troma, not just as the B-movie schlock studio, but as something to be respected. And with the interviews after to kind of back up your thesis at the beginning.
Yeah, I mean, that was something I really wanted to do, and how I came to work on this particular project with the University Press of Mississippi, which is considered one of the top, if not the top, pop culture, scholarly, and academic publishers. And to do it this particular way, where it's Lloyd's old interviews going all the way back to the early 80s, we talk about it even in the blurb on the back. I wanted to take Lloyd seriously. I wanted to take Troma seriously and put it in that academic and scholarly matrix. Because as fans of Troma know, and certainly fans of Lloyd know, or people who know Lloyd, he is much more than just Troma. He is much more than just the Toxic Avenger. He is much more than just the scatological and the TNA and all that. I mean, he's had such an impact on the continuum of film then and now, and I wanted something out there that would do that. His books are great, and some of the documentaries that have come out in the past are a lot of fun and great, but I wanted there to be one thing where it's like, no, let's actually take this guy seriously and understand and compile and analyze and scrutinize the messaging that's coming through and what he actually has to say. And just to wrap that up, I think it comes out really well, and I talk about this in the intro, the Chris Gore interview that we have in the book, and Chris is a friend, Film Threat, and all that. He really gets into it, I think, better than anybody else, talking about how Troma and Lloyd are so good at helping the medicine go down with sugar. Because if you think of something like the Toxic Avenger, it's not just monsters and mutants and TNA and head crushing. It's one of the first movies ever to talk about environmentalism and conservation. People forget back then, no one even knew what toxic waste was. I mean, we were just first starting to talk about that. And here Lloyd is putting it into this goofy, cartoonish, anti-superhero movie. So you can have a lot of fun with it and you can watch it and enjoy it. Or as we did, 11, 12-year-olds going, oh, yay. But also there's some serious messaging going in. And you can see that and you know that with every single film he's made, whether it's Poltergeist being about fast food companies and globalization and veganism, or Shakespeare Shitstorm being about the opioid crisis and big pharma. Every single one of his movies are dealing with these very hot topics and very important topics, often being very prescient. And you see that in these interviews. And I wanted there to be at least one resource like that brings that all together, to be like, look, Lloyd's a clown, Lloyd's goofy, Lloyd's having a lot of fun. That's what the Troma movies are really all about. But they're also saying something, and that's really important.
That definitely comes across a lot more in your book than if you just read like one interview with him. Because you'd be like, oh, okay, that's a pretty good idea that Lloyd will bring up. Is like we're also parroting in Poltergeist, the limousine liberals on and performative activism. And you're like, okay, well, that's kind of a cute soundbite. But then he backs it up. You could read about him talking about the same things during Sergeant Kabuki Man, and all the way forward, which I thought was really cool to see the evolution of Lloyd. But he's also the same man. His sound bites get tighter as it progresses. His statements become a little more concise, and he knows how to get the punchline faster. Sure. But it's still just as poignant as the early interviews in the book.
Lloyd is extremely consistent, and I was just talking to one of the writers at Fangoria. I don't know if the article is going to be out by the time this airs, or I said it before she was going to say it, which was Hunter S. Thompson used to talk about how his heroes were people like Bob Dylan and Muhammad Ali, namely because they never, quote unquote, sold out, which in the way he meant it was that they stayed very consistent with their vision and their worldview and their mission statement, if you will, throughout their entire careers, and never let anything kind of back them down from that. And I have always felt very similar, and this book proves it, and exactly what you just said. Lloyd is one of those people, as is, of course, Hunter Thompson himself. And right when I was saying that, Kim, the writer for Fangoria, was about to say, would you say that Lloyd is kind of the Bob Dylan of the independent film world? And I said, yeah, I mean, I would compare him to that, maybe not necessarily in content or voice or quality or whatever you want to put it, but as far as always being consistent with his vision. And just real quick, the question that's come up for me a lot is, what's the one thing that really surprised you about working on this book? And I said, and I talked with Lloyd about this, and I think it's even in the interview that I did for this book exclusively, I was quite amazed, impressed, and shocked that Lloyd has always been this way. I mean, going back to his earliest interviews, and I even read some interviews that he did that aren't in the book just because there wasn't room. I had to curate, of course, otherwise the book would be 80,000 pages. Because Lloyd does a million interviews then and now. But he came out of the gate talking like he does now, acting like he does now, not just as a goofball and a bit of a living cartoon character, but being a very outspoken provocateur. And that's not just, he's this, older guy who's been jaded by the industry and the world. And no. When he was in his early mid-20s, he was talking exactly the same way. So he has had that consistent vision of someone like a Hunter S. Thompson, a Bob Dylan, a Muhammad Ali. And I think that that's very powerful. And you're right. You see that in this book, that it's not just a fluke, that he was doing this over and over and over and over again.
Well, one of the things that did surprise me in the book was in his early interviews, he does not refer to Troma movies as art yet. He describes them as a good time at the movies, something that, that everyone will like. Even at one point, he's like, we don't glamorize sex and violence and drug use. And this is, during the squeeze play era of Troma. So I thought that was really interesting to see kind of that progression of Lloyd to maybe just self-actualization of himself as an artist instead of just I'm making, softcore, sexy comedies in New York to I'm a legitimate filmmaker.
Lloyd, I think another thing that you see in these interviews going all the way back to the early 80s and with pretty large publications, even the Village Voice, New York Times, Jack Mathews at the LA Times, people like that, Lloyd is clearly very savvy about publicity, and I've compared him, and I know I'm not the only one, to someone like P.T. Barnum. He's one of these ultimate hucksters. He is this kind of crazy Eddie type of character. The way he dresses, the way he talks, the way he acts. Again, another question I get is Lloyd always on? Is Lloyd like that in real life? Absolutely. He's like that. It's just who he is. He just has this persona that he is that way for the most part. But I think he is very good, too, at tempering his act when he needs to be. And as you just said, that was a different era in the Troma story. And so he knew how to talk to the media and to act in a certain way. And I think that was sincere, that not necessarily he didn't see his films as art, but he really wanted to put it out there that this is pure entertainment. This is purely goofy. We're just having a good time. We want to entertain people. In fact, one of the quotes we were going to pull for the back of the book was an earlier quote of Lloyd's where he does say something outright like, we're not making art, we're just making fun, or something like that. But we ended up not going with that. But I think a lot of it is not necessarily that Lloyd, who is a man of contradictions also, as we all know, he is a human being, he's not a robot. But I think it was more a matter of he knew how to temper his act and his persona, especially during that time when Troma itself was a bit of a different beast. But at the same time, and this comes up in the interviews, and anyone who's seen the movies know, even a movie like Squeeze Play or Waitress, even, First Turn On, there's still elements there that are very powerful sociopolitically. I mean, Squeeze Play in particular, I believe him in these interviews where he is talking about feminism, or you could see it in the movies that he has characters that are, bisexual or lesbian, or there's a lot of diversity in his movies before that really became a bigger thing. So he is still dealing with these socio-political aspects. Even in the kind of goofy, fun, this isn't art kind of movies, he couldn't help himself. He still got that in.
Another cool thing about Lloyd is, like you said, the contradictions.
Yeah.
Because sometimes he may have had a change of heart, or sometimes he just wants to see if the audience is paying attention.
I think it's a little bit of the latter. We were talking about this a little bit before we were doing the interview here. Of Lloyd does like to play the heel sometimes, and Lloyd does like to screw around with the interviewers. I mean, I think he gets a little bit bored, maybe. I think he likes to be provocative. One of his heroes and influences is Andy Warhol, of course, which he talks about a lot and which is very obvious in his interviews and in his films, and that's what Andy Warhol was doing. Andy Warhol would purposely try to screw with the interviews, and not necessarily the interviewers as people, but as a person, the interviewers as people, as a representative of a media that Andy Warhol saw, and certainly Lloyd saw and sees as a bit problematic. And he wants to kind of show the seams in some of the issues with media. And that's another way that Lloyd has been very prescient. We see now, for good or ill, most Americans don't trust the media anymore. And Lloyd has been kind of voicing that concern since day one, back in the days when you weren't really supposed to do that, back in the days when you were supposed to really look up to the media and take everything they said as concrete information, whatnot. Lloyd was always like, I don't know about this, all the way back in the earlier days. And now he's been proven right, because there are, and I'm a member of the media and have been for most of my life, there are a lot of problems there, and we have to deal with that. So I think Lloyd was sometimes kind of playing around with it to be a bit of a provocateur, to be a bit of a punk rocker, to have some fun and be entertaining, but also to make a very important point, the way that Andy Warhol and certain other people have over the years, Quentin Tarantino and others, to kind of play with that. Or even someone like P.T. Barnum, who would purposely, change things around in his biography and whatnot, not to be an asshole, not to be a liar, but to kind of show like, hey, this can evolve, this can change. James Joyce did the exact same thing with Ulysses and some of his other books. He purposely wanted each edition to be a little bit different so that it was a living thing, and to kind of play with the element of what is a publication, what is a book. It doesn't have to be static. And, whatever you might think about him, Kanye West is another really good example example of that. Of, he would keep changing the Saint Pablo or Life of Pablo album, online, because like you could, why not? It's not a CD, it's this digital thing. You could keep changing it. You could change the art, and so Lloyd has been doing that since back in the day, and I think that's a really important part of his larger, consistent vision.
And I've been on, multiple sides of the Lloyd interview where, it's, I'm sure going through, you've read probably the same 5 or 6 interviews that are almost word for word, where it's, the Lloyd doing the salesman shtick. Then there's the earnest Lloyd and heel Lloyd.
Yes.
And, as just like a diehard fan of reading the interviews, heel Lloyd always came across really funny because either you could tell he wanted the interviewer to ask him something different and something interesting,
sure,
or he just got tired of their line of questioning. And it's always just kind of funny to see where his brain would go with that type of stuff. Was there any good ones that you found that you're like, now Lloyd's coming across a little too much of an asshole in this one for me not to put in the book?
I certainly never had that concern. And a lot of my job, aside from finding these interviews, and I really wanted the interviews to be as eclectic as possible. I didn't want it to just be the New York Times, the Village Voice. We have punk zines. I went international. Some of them had to be translated. One of them is a Q&A that some guy did, I think, in Australia for a college thesis. We have, I really wanted it to be very varied, to show what Lloyd can do and also all the different publications and how he would interact with all these different people. And in fact, I'm very proud of this fact. And I have it, I think, in the introduction. The Conversations with Filmmakers series through University Press of Mississippi has been around for over 25 years. This is the first time that they allowed somebody to put in at least an excerpt from an AMA on Reddit. And I told them that for exactly what you just said. I really wanted to show what Lloyd is like when he is just full throttle, fucking around, having fun, and the audience too, and people heckling him, because there's nothing like that except for online or certainly an AMA. And they actually had to talk to their board and all these people that, like, we had to get permission to do it, but they allowed us to do it. And you could certainly see that. And I even have it's the one quote unquote article where I have a little italics where I say, we did not edit it at all. We did not. I mean, it's an excerpt because otherwise it would be too long. Yeah. But I did not clean up the language. I did not clean up the grammar, the spelling. I was like, I really wanted that all in there. And to be clear, all the other interviews, I certainly didn't clean up the language either. But I would clean up some of the grammar, spelling, and that kind of thing. The one other thing I will say is I experienced it myself recently, actually. Just this last week, Lloyd was going to be doing an interview with us remotely for a podcast, a different podcast than this one. And it's one he'd been on before, and we sent him all the information of what to do. And it's a little bit more serious. It's a little bit more structured. And Lloyd came on, and I will just say he was just running around in a bathroom in a restaurant. We were very lucky to have Charles Kaufman, his brother, there as well. But I mean, he was filming Charles peeing, and they were just running around the bathroom, and we couldn't get them to basically stand still. And it was like talking to two kids. I don't know if they were drunk or what, but they completely basically self-sabotage the entire interview, and I had to apologize to the people doing the podcast. Lloyd's been very contrite about it, like, sorry, I kind of missed the mark there. I thought we were supposed to have some fun and everything, so he was nice about it afterwards. But I myself experienced what Lloyd could be like when he wants to really go off script, and he did it, and even to me. So here we go.
When I had him on the show, I like kind of prepped him for like 3 or 4 days. I was like, hey, Lloyd, I'm not going to do the hey, right. Like, I'm not doing that Lloyd interview. I want to talk about real stuff.
Right.
And he's like, okay. And I think the first thing he did when he said, I was like, hey, Lloyd Kaufman. I was like, oh no.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's a lot about persona and such too. I mean, I won't go down the rabbit hole with other people that I've worked with or talked to in a similar way, but Phil Moore, who was the host of Nick Arcade, who's also remained a very close friend over the years when I worked on the Nickelodeon book. When we were working on the Mark Summers documentary, we of course wanted to interview Phil. And I spent all this time and energy getting this really great location for it. And we got all the permits and everything. We wanted to do it in this arcade. We had to do all this stuff in post-production to kind of blur out some of the names and stuff like that on the arcade games and all this, but had to do it because it's Phil Moore from Nick Arcade. And he comes on and we only had a little bit of time. And, Phil's another guy like Lloyd, where Phil Moore is like Phil Fillmore from Nick Arcade. He really is the game show guy.
Yeah.
Hey guys, blah, 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 blah. And I kind of had to pull him aside, and he's a friend. So I was able to say, hey, Phil, I need you to just kind of tone it down a little bit. Like, it's just too much. It's not going to work. Like, the documentary is a little more serious. Like, this isn't for kids, so to speak. And he completely got what I said. He kind of toned it down, but he can't help himself. I mean, every time I talk to Phil, it's no, Matt, man, what's up, Matt Klickstein? And I'm like, hey, Phil Moore. Like, he can't help himself. And he's in his 60s now. So, there's just some people who are that way. And Lloyd is certainly one of those. And it's just one of those things. And this particular podcast that I just did, it was, done over Zoom. So I could see the other guys. And one of them's a college professor and a rabbi and all this. It was a Jewish podcast thing. Lloyd's obviously Jewish as well. So we're going to be talking about Jewish themes and trauma. Like, it was going to be kind of serious, especially with everything that's been going on recently. And Lloyd was literally in a bathroom filming his brother peeing and all this stuff. And I could see the guys on the other side kind of looking at me, and I'm looking, it was kind of like, I don't know what to do here. And there was a little element of, it's Lloyd Kaufman. I mean, what are you going to do? I mean, what can we do? You can't.
And also, it's like, I don't know what you're expecting. It's Lloyd Kaufman.
Yes. When Keith Richards was in the Pirates of the Caribbean movie, I forget which one, I think the third one or whatever, as Johnny Depp's father, there was a whole thing about that where, he was a little hard to work with and kind of drunk and crazy and all this. And I remember seeing him in an interview and going like, hey, when you have Keith Richards on your set, you're going to get Keith Richards. It's like, what do you expect? I mean, that's just the way that it's going to be. And so, in a little bit of a way, you kind of sometimes have to be a bit of a Lloyd wrangler. But, again, to his credit, and for people who don't know him and whatnot, I mean, he's still to this day, and it was just a few days ago, but he's been apologizing. Oh, sorry, I misunderstood. And I thought you guys wanted me to be kind of the goofier side and all this. And I keep telling him, hey, it's all right. We had fun. We'll figure out, how to use it. The podcast guys are figuring out how to get in there. Cause I did tell them, I said, guys, as much of a goof as that was, like, it's pretty cool that you guys have Charles Kaufman and Lloyd Kaufman together and that they're in a bathroom and all that. Like, you guys could get some stuff going with that. Like, you got to figure out a way to
start up their OnlyFans.
Yeah, exactly. Well, there you go. So, you can't just throw that away. I mean, you got to do something with it. That's kind of an amazing little moment. So,
going back to the AMA that's in the book, for anybody out there who has never met Lloyd, reading that is just captures exactly what it's like if you're at a convention and you wander up to Lloyd at the table and you're kind of shy to meet him, so you're just standing there listening to everybody mobbing Lloyd. It's exactly what it's like, and he will bust everybody's balls right there at the table and also just take it right in good stride and have a good laugh. And I thought that was really cool that you included it, because it was like a breather from him being very professional, as professional as Lloyd can be, to just having a great time, just bullshitting with the fans, which that's why arguably why they've been around for 50 years.
Yeah, I mean I've actually written about this and talked about this before. I myself take a lot of the work that I do seriously. It's one of the things that I really appreciate about the projects I've been able to work on is I'm not just going to do a book about Nickelodeon and hey, Nickelodeon's fun and Ren and Stimpy and blah, 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 blah. Like I took that the subject matter very seriously. We talked about some pretty deep and intense issues and things like that. I didn't get into some of the stuff that's come out more recently in some of these documentaries and whatnot. I didn't really want to get into that stuff, but more about the creation of the network and where it came from and the impact it's had on our culture. And so too with The Simpsons. I love taking these kind of pop culture fun like live cartoon type of aspects. That's why I think Lloyd fits in so well, but taking them seriously, especially now that these are a lot of things that many people from our generation grew up on and we still are talking about. We're doing this podcast series right now, and I have this book coming out and there's these documentaries. It's like, okay, these things were a lot of fun and they helped to raise us, and The Simpsons and Nickelodeon and everything else and Nintendo and whatnot, but let's actually look at how they came together and the people behind them. And you do find over and over again that the people, very much like Lloyd, were very educated and very serious about what they were doing, even if they were doing goofy things like Ren and Stimpy or Adventures of Pete and Pete or the stuff at The Simpsons or whatever it might be. And to be able to talk to them now as adults, as people who have gone to college, as people who have, are familiar with a lot of the books and some of the hidden references. I mean, you see in the book, Lloyd is constantly talking about Bertolt Brecht, and he takes this stuff about Shakespeare very seriously. And he's always talking about these, important foreign filmmakers and these Japanese films and John Ford. And as adults now, we can watch the movies and say, no, he's serious. He really is getting that stuff in there. He's referencing these other movies and classical literature and classical music. And I think that's been part of the joy that I've had in working on these projects over the years. And certainly this one is, again, let's take Troma and Lloyd seriously. And that was something I really wanted to do. And I'm glad I was able to do it in this book in a way that is quite literally an academic scholarly text through a university press.
Well, one thing you mentioned, all like how Lloyd talks about his influences, and another thing that comes across in all these interviews is how much of a sentimentalist Lloyd is.
Totally.
Because he will talk about, Bergman and Ernest Lubitsch and all these filmmakers, and then in the next breath be my Grammy Kaufman was probably one of the biggest influences of my life by giving me books when I was a teenager, and my father teaching me how to be funny. And it's just really sweet to see those sides of Lloyd, even all the way through the end of the book where he's Grammy and Papa Kaufman have passed away, but he's now Grandpa Lloyd, and he's talking about his grandkids and his kids' success and his wife. Like, it's consistent through his whole life, which I think also says a lot about Lloyd's character, which people are like, this crazy fucked up movies, he's got to be nuts. But it's like, no, he's like a sweetheart at the end of the day.
Domestic. I mean, he's been married to the same woman for as long as he's had Troma. And, his relationship even with Michael Hertz. I mean, this is a guy that he more or less almost grew up with and, certainly was at college with. And a lot of the people that he's worked with over the years, he's still very close with and he talks very well about and, and that kind of thing. I mean, Lloyd is very loyal and very dedicated to his people. And I think that that's a really important thing. I was talking about this a little bit earlier as well. I've worked with the kids of Whitney High for more than half my life now. A group of, they were young adults with developmental disabilities. Now they're adult.
They're all our age now.
No, we did stuff with Troma and Lloyd over the years and even showed some stuff at Troma Dance and that kind of thing. The Kids of Whitney High documentary is on Troma now. It's called Act Your Age if anybody wants to watch it. But for years, whenever I would talk with Lloyd, one of the first things he'd ask was specifically names of some of the Kids of Whitney High members. How's so-and-so doing? How's so-and-so doing? He would talk with them over email, phone calls. I mean, he really stayed, a good friend of these people. And for them, that was really important because many of them, especially after they graduated high school, didn't have a lot of socializing and were kind of, a lot of them were also very poor. And so they were kind of just stuck in their apartment, living off of disability, watching TV all day. And so to have someone like Lloyd Kaufman talk with them or ask about them was a really big thing for them. And that was when, for me, I hate to get, kind of sappy and saccharine, but I was like, no, Lloyd's the real deal because, a lot of people that we worked with the Kids of Whitney High, Jimmy Fallon being one of them and certain other people, didn't do that, let's just say. But Lloyd did. I will say, funnily enough, the Jackass guys were like that too. The Jackass guys stayed very much in touch with the Kids of Whitney High. We worked with them on some things, Chris Pontius and Johnny Knoxville, because they were in the Johnny Knoxville movie with Katherine Hagel, The Ringer. And they were really good to the kids. And I always really respected them for that. But Lloyd was one of those people. You see that in the book, that Lloyd's married to the same woman and still with Michael Hertz and works with a lot of the same people over and over again, even when he's yelling at them, even when he's screaming at them, even when he hates them and they hate him, they come back for more. And it's because at the end of the day, we all love Lloyd. And if you can get in with him in that regard, and it's relatively easy to do, he stays with you as a close friend.
And I know I brought this up on the show before, but when I worked on Poultrygeist, like it definitely was. There he talks in the book about them not knowing how to make the right size turds, and that was me he was referring to in the book. But I will say it was the big size Baby Ruth's, but it shrunk in that hot bathroom. All the yelling and screaming aside during the day, at the end of the day, Lloyd would come up to each person individually on set and thank them genuinely for helping make his movie. And I don't think you get that on like a huge budget movie set, maybe you do, but that is always stuck with me where it's like he doesn't need to do that, but we're not getting paid, and that meant more to me that like, hey, this legendary filmmaker is genuinely thanking me for the hard work that I'm doing, and I always thought that was cool about him.
Lloyd has always been really good to me, even before we became very friendly. When I first had just kind of done a couple things with him or talked with him a couple times, and I used to brag to friends of mine because a lot of people in my friend group and work group ever since I was younger were trauma people, and whenever Lloyd or trauma would come up, I would say oh, I know him and he knows me, and it wasn't the kind of thing of like, oh, I met this guy once. I mean, anytime I would see Lloyd, because he obviously travels around a lot. He did then, he still does now, and I move around a lot, so we were kind of always crossing paths. But I used to kind of joke around, like I would go to different conventions or comic book shops or wherever he'd be doing signings and such, and he would always kind of wave me over, and he would even call out to everybody, hey everybody, this is Mathew Klickstein, he wrote the book on Nickelodeon, or he did this or he did that. And I mean, even in the earlier days, I just remember thinking, wow, Lloyd always remembers me. Lloyd knows who I am. He tells everyone I'm here. Like, he would make me feel so welcome and so warm and such a part of it. And I would tell people, be like, yeah, it's like, out of my way, I know Santa Claus, it's like and he would just bring me, and people would even be whispering like, who's that? And it's a friend of Lloyd's and all this. And he made me feel so welcome. And so, I mean, I'm getting shivers just thinking about it. Even when I was, much younger and just getting started in the field of making documentaries and pop culture books. I mean, Lloyd was one of those people where whenever I saw him, wherever I'd go, maybe it was years in between us seeing each other. Hey, there's Mathew Klickstein. He just walked in. Mathew, come over here and say hi to everybody. And I knew that Lloyd was the real deal. He didn't have to do that, and he would always do that. And I know I wasn't the only one that he would do that kind of thing with. And just his memory. I mean, most of his movies have 8,000 people working on them, and all these different actors and such.
And then the conventions, and
I've seen him do that with other people. I mean, he remembers you, and he knows who you are, and he makes you feel very welcome and warm. And the fact he did that with the kids at Whitney High, the fact that he's done that with me, I mean, I've really experienced it. And, Lloyd's not perfect, and there's stories of some not nice things that have happened. I mean, he's a human being and all this stuff. But at the end of the day, I think Lloyd is a very good man and a good person. He's clearly a good father. He gets along very well with his daughters. They've become very successful. I know I'm lucky enough to know Patty too. Patty's an amazing woman and really cool. She certainly didn't need to stay with him all these years. She's had her own life, her own very impressive career. There's just a very obvious string there of whatever you want to say about Lloyd, whatever experiences you've had with Lloyd or with trauma over the years. Some have been good, some have been bad. I've heard negative stories from people over the years too. Hey, that happens. But, at his core, I think that he's a really good person, has a good soul, because he's always been very good to me and a lot of the people that I know. And the people that have stuck with him, like his wife, like his daughters, like Michael Hertz, like a lot of people who've worked with him over the years, are still very much there for him, 30, 40, 50 years later.
Refuse Films and Troma Entertainment presents the Troma Archive Collection on Blu-ray. Series 1 of the Troma Archive Collection includes The Toxic Avenger, Sergeant Kabuki Man, NYPD, and the world Blu-ray premiere of Trey Parker's Cannibal the Musical. Refuse Films has been granted access all areas in the Troma Film Archives in New York City, unarchiving previously unreleased materials from the darkest depths of the Troma vaults. The Troma Archive Collection Blu-ray sublabel brings you alternate cuts, unseen footage, rare interviews, and a host of traumatic special features. Sourcing and remastering materials across all formats for newly scanned 35mm and 16mm restorations to Digibeta, Betacam, and U-Matic tapes. Each Troma Archive Collection Blu-ray release is limited to only 3,000 units per title. Pre-order the Troma Archive Collection on Blu-ray right now, exclusively from refusefilms.com.
This show, as well as all of the programming on Loudspeaker, is listener-supported. What that means to you is that rather than go to corporate sponsors and advertisers who are trying to sell you crap you don't need, we go straight to you. We go to the audience, and our audience helps us do what we do. The way you do that is by making a tax-deductible contribution to Loudspeaker. Go to loudspeaker.org and click on the support button. You can give one time or every month. It's entirely up to you, and we thank you so much for your support. Every single dollar helps us keep the lights on and tell more interesting stories like the one you're hearing right now. Thanks again for listening. Now let's get back to the show.
One of the interviews in the book I wanted to talk about, which was really special, and I'm glad you got it in here, was from our friend Doug Sackman from his I Am an Evil Carrot zine. And you and Doug go back as well. Yeah. Would you mind talking about including that and just some memories with Doug?
Here come those shivers again.
That's part of the trauma thing. Like when family. Lloyd says we're the trauma family, like
it is. It really is. It really, really is. You know, it's like I'm tearing up a little bit. I mean, Doug was an extremely close friend of mine. You know, I would stay with him when I'd be in Philadelphia for different things. He would always invite me in. I met a lot of people through Doug. He was one of the people who really brought me into the trauma world. You know, we worked together on a few different things. He worked with the kids at Whitney High also. We were always talking about maybe making a Kids at Whitney High movie together. And Doug's just one of those people I really looked up to him. I hate to say it, even though I knew him for so long and even though we were very close, I, for some reason, thought he was much older than I. Or actually, you know, he passed away, you know, recently, unfortunately, and he was the same age. I think he's like 6 months older. I thought he was like 10 years older because he was kind of this very avuncular older brother kind of guy. I mean, that's how I looked up to him. And I wouldn't just talk with him about trauma things. I wouldn't just talk with him about Lloyd. I mean, I would ask his advice. I mean, I really looked up to him like an older brother, like an uncle, or like a mentor of sorts. And he was so filled with knowledge and information. And he was always so willing to give it out. And he was so willing to connect me to other people. Through Doug, I met Tim Seeley, who's another big trauma guy. Tim helped me get into the comic book world. And I've done comic book series with some pretty big companies over the years because of Tim. And I met Tim because of Doug. And there's a number of other people that I've met. So Doug really impacted my life. I loved him like an older brother and uncle, like I said. I really looked up to him. I was texting him, you know, that morning when we found out what happened and was a little shocked that I didn't hear back from him and then got the news. And it still hurts and it's still really hard. And I'd already talked with him about getting that interview in well before he passed away. But before the book was going to print, I had to get something in there about Doug. And I was actually able to, you know, I don't know if they actually said the word, but, you know, stop the presses. And I said, is there any way before it kind of goes to wherever it's going to get printed or whatnot, I can sneak in one quick little thing about Doug Sackman because we just found out he passed away. And I really wouldn't feel right if we weren't able to get something in there about him. And they totally understood. And I think they did delay the printing a little bit so that I can get in a little thing about Doug. Because he wasn't just an amazing filmmaker and not just an amazing artist, but he was such a good friend. And I know so many people, not just in the trauma world, but in the film world and the horror world, because Doug was involved in so many different things, the eating competition community, obviously, who know Doug. And it's a point where I don't even ask him, oh, do you know who Doug Sackman is? I'm like, I'll just say like, oh yeah, I was old friends with Doug. And they're, oh, isn't that a shame? Like, everyone knows Doug. And he's just a great guy. And I'm still very close with a lot of the people that I met through Doug. So, yeah, I'm glad we were able to get that interview in. And I'm glad I was able to get in something mentioning Doug because he was just a great person. I really miss him a lot.
And it's a really good interview too. He has a pretty funny way of asking really serious, like poignant trauma questions, and then just following it up with something just batshit nonsensical.
Yeah, who would win in a fight, you or Mel Brooks?
Yeah,
I mean, it's just like, no, he was good at that. I will say that was one I did have to clean up quite a bit because the grammar and spelling was horrendous. But it was a zine, and that goes to what I was saying too. Of not just because Doug's a good friend, and I thought that his interview was pretty good, but I wanted again to show that, hey, we can have the New York Times in here, we can have the LA Times, we can have the Village Voice, we can also have this punk rock zine. And in fact, I had a little bit of a butting heads with the publisher. I mean, they were great the whole way through. Don't get me wrong. University Press of Mississippi was fantastic. I really loved working with them. I love their editorial team. They've been great with everything. So I'm very happy with them. I'm not just saying that because they might be listening to this, but I really mean it. But one thing, there were a few little confrontations we had, and they wanted to capitalize the title of Doug's zine, I Am an Evil Carrot. And I said, no, I really want to keep it lowercase because that's how Doug had it in the zine. He literally sent me a facsimile of the original zine. So I pulled it from that. I mean, I really had it the way that he had it in the original printed zine because Doug sent that to me. And I don't even think it is online. So I think I had to do it that way. But I told them I want to keep it lowercase because that's how Doug had it. And I want to show that you can have something like that. What a wacky, silly name. I am an evil carrot. And it's lowercase stylistically right next to the New York Times. And I wanted to show that those are the kinds of people that Doug would talk, or that Lloyd would talk to, and places that he was interviewed in. And that was very important for me. But yes, there was some grammar and spelling that I did also want to fix.
Well, it's also cool, too, to read the Lloyd interview and the Doug zine, then the New York Times, and then a college thesis interview. And whether it's for Lloyd knowing that the zine might have an audience of 20 people and New York Times is going to have millions, he treats both interviews with equal respect. And he doesn't punch down to the one that he thinks is not going to have good readership. It's not really consistent's not the right word, but respect for both, and he's going to give them a good answer no matter what.
Well, if anything, I'm sure you're thinking this too. If anything, he would probably be more disrespectful to the larger publications because he's obviously very anti-authoritarian. He's very class conscious. I mean, he is that kind of working class hero aspect, while at the same time, again, one of his great contradictions, he's very open about the fact that he came from a very privileged upper class background, and he was there in the highest profile aspects of Manhattan, and his father was a prominent lawyer, and that kind of thing. So he can come from that world, but at the same time be very again, anti-authoritarian, and talks a lot about C.S. Mills and the power elite. And that kind of thing. And it kind of makes sense. Some people might be surprised, but it makes sense when you think about it, that he more or less grew up with Oliver Stone and they were at college together, and Oliver Stone came from a similar world. And look at Oliver Stone. It's the same kind of thing. I mean, he came from a very privileged background, and yet at the same time, he spent most of his career fighting that kind of world. And I think in some ways it kind of helps maybe to come from that world to understand it and to really get into the nuances of it and how it works and why it works, while at the same time, as you said, and comes up a lot in the book, that his grandmother in particular, who was more or less a card-carrying, communist or whatever, and very, anarchist and the whole thing, and was giving young Lloyd as a boy all these books like Mills's Power Elite and other books like that, and Brave New World, not the Aldous Huxley one, but a different one that was talking a lot about these kinds of things, about class war and culture changes and socialism and all these things of that nature. So Lloyd was able to grow up in this very affluent world, and it allowed him to be very educated, and he got to go to all these Broadway shows, and he got to travel, and he got really good education. So he was absolutely a smart boy, went to Yale when that still really meant something, and was able to absorb all those different kinds of things, but at the same time had his grandma as kind of a Jiminy Cricket saying, hey, don't forget these rich people are assholes, and you need to fight the man, and you need to fight the power. And that was clearly something that's there when he was younger. You see them in these interviews, and you absolutely see them in his films today, even fighting against allies when appropriate or necessary. Certain aspects of the independent film world, it comes up in the book, the American Film Market Association, and some of these other organizations, because for him, even groups that he is allied with and collaborating with and that he's partnered with, he wants to make sure that they're doing the best that they can do. And he might need to criticize them a bit. He might need to kind of punch at them a little bit, say, hey, you're not doing what you need to be doing for me and for other people like me. And just because we're on the same side doesn't mean I'm not going to fight back. And we certainly see that politically and sociopolitically. Obviously, he has a lot to say about Trump. Obviously, he has a lot to say about, Bush and George W. Bush in particular. He went to college with George W. Bush at the same time. But he also has a lot of complaints about Hillary Clinton. He has a lot of complaints about Al Gore, as you said, limousine liberals and that kind of thing like that. So Lloyd is very much the kind of person who will, he will say what he needs to say, and it doesn't matter if, you're on his side or not. And I really appreciate that about him.
When we were doing the Troma-Palooza concerts, we brought Lloyd out. We had him come on to one of the local heavy metal radio stations in Colorado, KBPI, which was a Clear Channel owned radio station. I know where this is going. And so we brought him in, and Lloyd's acting very polite, and we're waiting in the lobby. He's like, "Oh, Clear Channel. Clear Channel, huh? And so we get up and he's like, yeah, no, it's we're on the air. He's like, it's really nice that the mega conglomerate Clear Channel will allow somebody like me on their radio station under the guise of a benefit concert. Yeah. And just
like Lloyd.
tearing into the bureaucratic elite on their own platforms was one of the most delicious things I've ever seen in real life.
Yeah, no, I mean, we were talking about Bob Dylan before. I mean, now I'm thinking obviously about the famous moment with Kurt Cobain and the Rolling Stone cover where his shirt is saying corporate magazines still suck. And a lot of people might not know this, but he actually had a different shirt underneath that they didn't want him to wear because I think it was vulgar or had swearing on it or something like that. I can't remember. Maybe it was some band name that had bad words in it or something like that. But they made him change his shirt, and he literally just turned it inside out and wrote on it, corporate magazines still suck. And, it's the same kind of thing. And I think that that's really a powerful thing that Lloyd does and has always done. And as I've said already, and as I brought up in other interviews, you see that in these interviews that's not just the, bitter, jaded, now that, he's this older guy and maybe forgotten by some people or maligned by some people or kind of like kicked to the sidelines or whatever. He's acting like that. No, right out of the gate, he was doing that. Even when the New York Times were still coming and calling, even when Village Voice was still coming and calling, he was like, hey, wait a second. Here's a little bit of fuck you here too, because blah, 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 or this, that, or the other. And talking about political figures and talking about, he is an iconoclast. He is literally an iconoclast. I mean, that is who he is and what he does. And I don't think he could not do that. And it's just a part of his life and has been ever since he was obviously probably born. I mean, he was coming out right there with his silver spoon. He obviously had, some fiery arrows too. And it's one of the things that I love about Lloyd and have always appreciated about Lloyd, and that you absolutely positively see in the book. Here is the proof. This isn't a guy saying, oh, when I was in my 20s, blah, blah. It's like, no, you're seeing what he was saying in his 20s in these articles. And he talked then as he talks now. He's never changed that, as with all of his contradictions and with his kind of different personas and whatnot. The one big consistent thing is, we talk about speaking truth to power. Well, he's been doing that before, most people even thought to do that or would want to do that. And I think that that's such an important part of who Lloyd is. And that, of course, is very impactful into the world of Troma.
And even, going back to his films and stuff from the 80s, where we stand in 2025, Lloyd has been warning us that this is going to happen if we don't keep stuff in check. And it's, right now we're living in, the Tromaville that he's warned us that this is going to happen if we are not paying attention to him. And, you could tell like, and he's still like during COVID, he would go out there during the Black Lives Matter marches and stuff like that. So it's nice to see that nearly 80-year-old man with a bow tie can still just be as punk rock as anybody else and put his, just put up where, he's going to stand up for what's right.
One of the other aspects of the book that I'm really proud of, and also proud of Lloyd very much because it's his words, is it's not just about being irreverent for irreverent's sake. It really is how prescient and prophetic it is. And as you said before, Zach, to see it in a collection of these different interviews and articles over the years, as opposed to just one, you can actually track certain things that were going on culturally or with technology or with politics in the interviews that Lloyd's making, so that you have an interview maybe he's doing in the early or mid 80s about all these different topics about what's going on in the world. And, at the time, maybe, oh, that's just crazy, or, oh, you're just being paranoid. And then, an interview, maybe 2 or 3 interviews later, 5 or 10 years later, he's still talking about it. And it's like, yeah, actually, that's a good point. That might actually happen. 5 or 10 years later, a few more interviews later, it's like, now it's happening. And he's like, see, I told you. And you see that over and over and over again. It is something like, hey, there's this new thing called video stores, and it's really helping out Troma, and it's going to help out independent film studios like us. Isn't that great? And then it's like, wait a second, now the studios are starting to get in. They're kind of pushing us out. That's not good. And then a few interviews later, it's like, there's this company called Blockbuster that's buying up all the things, and, it's run by all these conglomerates. That's really bad. And then it keeps going and going, to a point where it's like, oh, now that entire scene has been completely destroyed. And you can kind of track that with Lloyd. Same thing with the internet. Same thing with the streaming services. That kind of goes to what you were saying earlier, where, some of his opinions about things might have, I wouldn't say changed, but they evolved because he would get into these different things like streaming, like, you know, one of the first people on the internet with a film studio, like video stores, but he would be talking, you know, interviews later, we need to be careful about this because, you know, now the big boys are starting to get involved and they're going to corrupt this, they're going to ruin it. And you could literally track them in his interviews.
And then it's like, oh, our YouTube channel got taken off because we're not, you know, we're not one of the big players.
Exactly. And you really see that, and not just with things like that, but also with sociopolitical things and with economic things. You can see that Lloyd was so aware of what was going to happen next in these interviews. And he goes from, you know, being Chicken Little, you know, or you know, screaming about the skies falling, to, hey, maybe you're right, to, oh, whoops, you were right, to, hey, how did you know that? And it's like, because you assholes weren't listening to me, and you're still not fucking listening to me, and I've been right about all these goddamn things for 50 years. Maybe you should fucking listen to me, you know? Like, but so I think that that's something that I'm really proud of, and I worked really hard in choosing the right interviews and curating them for a lot of different reasons, but that was one of them. Was I really liked kind of finding certain topics that Lloyd would be talking about, and that he ultimately, unfortunately, much of the time was proven right. And you know, I think that that's something that comes out very much through the book, and that's, you know, I'm happy to have been able to be there to find those articles and to curate them, but that's all Lloyd's voice and that's Lloyd's mind, and I can't take credit for that.
Was there any interviews that you just had to axe from the book that you're like, if there's going to be like a second volume of the book, that this interview is definitely going to go back in?
That's a really good question that nobody's asked me yet. I don't think so. I don't remember feeling like I had to take any out for any other reason than, you know, they just didn't fit, because Lloyd says a lot of the same things over and over and over again for years. Some of them ended up being a bit repetitive. That was something else that I really wanted to do, was not just make sure they were eclectic as far as New York Times versus a punk rock zine versus an AMA, but I really wanted him to talk about kind of, you know, even though he's bringing up a lot of the same things a lot of the time, you know, that the focus of the article is about something different. So this one might be about a certain movie. That one might be about one of his books. That one might be about Trauma Now. That one might be about his take on what's going on with AFMA. That one might be about Comic-Con. So I wanted it to the content too to be very eclectic and to have a large array, because Lloyd does talk about so many different things. I don't think that there was any time where I said, boy, I'd love to have that interview in, but there's just not enough room. It really came down to, and to their credit, University Press of Mississippi never gave me a full-on word count. I mean, I think there would have been a point if I had like 50 more interviews, they would have been like, hey, Matt, come on. But nobody ever said no. Nobody ever said, hey, we need to cut this down. I mean, I can tell you right now, and not surprisingly, for how much I ramble here, and Zach, you've been doing a good job of keeping me in check. But, you know, I could be fairly garrulous, and my introduction is pretty long. I really thought they were going to cut it because a lot of the introductions to these books are much shorter, and they went with it, and I'm very proud of that one too. So yeah, there was no real limitations on how long or short the book could be. I really feel like I chose the interviews I wanted in there. Obviously, there's many interviews that we could put in if there was going to be a sequel or an update, and there's certainly been interviews even since then. I mean, the book itself has been done for the most part for a little over a year now.
It's not like anything has happened in this last year.
Exactly.
So,
well,
even this last week.
Oh, yeah, no, I will say, and I don't know if he would listen to this because he's become a friend. I feel bad for making Blair, just because, you know, we did the best we could to track everything with the Toxic Avenger reboot or reimagining. I'm sorry. And unfortunately, we missed, you know, the fact that it's actually coming out now. So it ends, that storyline ends with it just being shelved. But I think that's part of the fun of it. And, you know, maybe we will do updates in the future. I know University Press of Mississippi has done updates to older books of theirs, the Quentin Tarantino one, for example, because things happen and the filmmakers keep going, and not all of them are dead by the time the book comes out. Even though we joke about that a little bit in the introduction, which is true. I told Lloyd that this book's probably not going to come out until he's dead, and we'll have to do the book launch at his eulogy. But here we are. He's still alive. So, you know.
Well, I think on that we should start to kind of wrap things up a little bit. But I do want to ask, do you have, personally, what's your favorite Trauma movie?
Mother's Day.
Mother's Day.
Yep, there's no question. I mean, and I get that question. I even have it in the book. I have a little thing of that. Everyone's going to ask me what my favorite Troma movie is, and it is definitively, absolutely Mother's Day. And Lloyd has said multiple times, even recently, without my prompting him, he has said that it's his favorite film also. It's even though he didn't have much to do with it, it's his brother Charles, who, we just talked about, was in the bathroom with him during this kind of crazy interview we just did. But I absolutely love Mother's Day. It's one of my favorite movies of all time. I've talked about in the past, even before all this, that I think it has one of the best opening sequences of not just any horror film, of any movie, period. I think you could show the opening sequence to Mother's Day in any film class or even any writing class or storytelling class and say, this is how storytelling works. It's almost its own little short film. The way that the characters develop, how quickly it introduces everything that's going on, the world, the style, the voice. It's quirky, it's weird, it's kind of funny, but kind of not. I think I'm a big John Waters fan, and I love especially a lot of his earlier films, especially movies like Female Trouble. I think it outdoes even those films where it makes you feel kind of dirty watching it. You feel kind of bad. You're sort of connecting with the characters. It's got that Michael Haneke thing going on, like with a movie like Funny Games, like you're kind of sympathizing with the bad guys, and then it changes who's bad and who's good. And I absolutely love the opening sequence to Mother's Day, and I think that the rest of the movie is absolutely fantastic. I watch it at least once or twice a year just to remind me of what good filmmaking is. And yeah, it's low budget. Yeah, it's DIY-ish. Yeah, it's a bit goofy. Yes. But it's still a beautiful film. It's very well done. And I would put it right up there with a movie like the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre, where it kind of seems like this dirty, bootleg, messy film, but also you have to sit there, especially if you're a filmmaker, and go, that took a lot to make it look like that. Like, wow, Tobe Hooper really knows what he's doing, even though the movie looks like, it was made by a bunch of drunken people when they were stoned. It's like, and then you watch the behind the scenes of Texas Chainsaw Massacre,
it was.
and no, they did that one shot 80 different times. I mean, the man was fucking like Charlie Chaplin or something like that. And Mother's Day feels that way too. And I will say real quick also that even though it's not a Troma film, obviously, I love the reboot or reimagine, whatever you want to call it, of Mother's Day also. I think that it's a lot of fun, even though it's a very different film. A lot of it is one of my favorite actresses of all time, Rebecca De Mornay. She completely nails it. I would put her right up against Kathy Bates' Annie Wilkes in Misery. I mean, she brings so much to it, but the whole rest of the movie is fantastic. So, no, the original Mother's Day is my favorite, but for those who are interested, the reboot is quite good too. I really like the Mother's Day reboot.
Do you have a favorite Lloydism or Lloyd quote? and if you don't mind, if you could do it in your best Lloyd impression.
It's funny, when you were talking about when Lloyd texted you went into the Lloyd voice, and I was like, yeah, that is what Lloyd sounds like when he texts, because he is always like, Mathew, hey, it's Lloyd, it's Uncle Lloydie, Matthew. I can't do it as well.
XO, okay.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, and it's a little bit of a more serious one. Not just that whenever people ask how we meet, he always likes to mention that we met on Grindr, which for the record is not necessarily true. But I love when he talks about, and he brings this up a lot in his interviews, the idea of Shakespeare's "To thine own self be true," and then he always, of course, has to back it up with, or that 101 best ways of writing a screenplay, Hamlet. It's like he always loves to bring in Shakespeare. He loves to bring in Hamlet, but the idea that his main goal, I mean, I think I even talk about it in the intro. I think he says it at least 4 or 5 times in the interviews. "To thine own self be true," and even though it's not his quote, it's something that he has taken and turned into his own thing. And it makes sense again, because here we are, Romeo and Juliet and Shakespeare's shitstorm being the Tempest. So he obviously really believes that. And you can see the very Shakespearean aspects of a lot of the characters in his films and a lot of the storytelling in his films, the epic quality, the family, the relationships, everything that's there. I mean, his films are very operatic and they are very Shakespearean. So once again, this isn't just him being goofy. It's not just him being a bullshitter. I bet you he knows more about Shakespeare than most people. I mean, he probably could teach a class on it because clearly it's all there in his blood, in his interviews, and in his films. But to thine own self be true.
I mean, even his whole life is very Shakespearean.
Yes.
You have the underdog fighting against a mega conglomerates. Like his life is Othello, but with penis monsters.
Well, and also I've actually brought this up before as a comparison too. He is speaking very much to the groundlings while giving a middle finger to the royalty who are there paying for it. And so he wants to give entertainment to the people who are literally there in the mud and watching him there by the stage. Meanwhile, all the royalty and all the finery and everything, and they're up there, in the balcony. They could barely even hear the play for these tickets that they spent all this money on and whatnot. And like, that's exactly what he's doing with Troma films, is he is making movies for the kind of working class, if you will, for that blue collar aspect, for people who do want to just watch burps and farts and blood and guts and tits and ass and all these things, while making fun of the people who are watching it, because it's like, oh, I can watch an art film, I can watch, a Troma film, I'm right there too, right, money, and all these kinds of things like that. And so he's making fun, very much the way John Waters would do. It's very, very similar to that. Or even someone like, especially in his earlier days, someone like Martin Scorsese, could do the exact same thing, or Brian De Palma, or Carpenter, or Cronenberg, or Tarantino in a lot of ways. There's people who do that, or even obviously the French New Wave. I mean, that was what Godard was all about. And I think that when Lloyd, references French filmmakers, I mean, he's doing that exact same thing, where he can make a genre film for the fun audience, for the audience that's into that kind of thing, but also be making fun of the people who are watching it because, oh, it's an art film and that kind of thing. So he's very good at that. And that's a very Shakespearean thing to do, even though it's on more the meta aspect.
Which is funny to think about. Like, Shakespeare doesn't quite have that reputation anymore. It's definitely thought more intellectual, but going back to its roots, it's very Troma. And
completely. Lloyd said it before, and I 100% agree with him. I think that Shakespeare, and I don't know as much about Shakespeare as he or the next person, but I've read a lot of books about him, and I've seen a lot of documentaries about him. I'm very interested in Shakespeare. For frankly, a lot of the reasons we're talking about here is because I think that that's been lost. And I think, frankly, a lot of the Shakespeare adaptations that have come out over the years, even some of the most, prestigious ones and the most award-winning ones, are missing that. They're missing the Troma aspect. It would be like taking Pink Flamingos and turning it into a movie that takes out all of the shit eating and all the sex and violence and all that kind of stuff. And I think a lot of that has been taken out of what Shakespeare was doing, because I do believe, from what I've read about him and what I've learned about him, is that he was ultimately making entertainment for the masses and wanted them to have something that they can come to and say, yeah, screw the royalty. Yes. While they're there in the audience with them. And I'll say that about Lloyd, especially because not only does he do that with Shakespeare, but one of his other big influences, not just Andy Warhol, who did the exact same thing, but Charlie Chaplin. I really think that Charlie Chaplin was such a genius at that, where he can make these movies that seem like they were art and seem like they were masterpieces and seem like, he would spend all this time and energy on them. And, Charlie Chaplin was hobnobbing with, the rich people and whatnot. And he became one of them and all that kind of thing. But at the same time, he's totally mocking and making fun of, he is quite literally biting the hand that feed it. And very much like Lloyd, and very much like someone like John Cassavetes, and very much like someone like Stanley Kubrick and a lot of these other people, toward the end of his career, Charlie Chaplin, was had some of those troubles and whatnot, because people were kind of tired of him sort of pointing his finger at them and saying, you guys are the problem. And yes, the people who are giving me the money to make these movies and the people who are supporting me and such. And that's why he, very much like Lloyd, very much like Cassavetes, had to start funding his own movies and that kind of thing. Lenny Bruce and, a lot of these people, a lot of jazz musicians. And, it's kind of like, hey, you know what? I'm not going to work on Maggie's Farm no more, going back to Bob Dylan. And that's Charlie Chaplin. I think there's a little bit of that in Shakespeare, though the end of his life is a little different. And definitely Lloyd. And you see that. And you see that in Charlie Chaplin, where, he can have these beautiful love stories and he can be talking about these important issues and whatnot. And at the same time, pie fights. And at the same time, fart noises, and all these kinds of things, like with the little weird sound effects and stuff he was able to use, and all these kinds of things that he would do in City Lights and Modern Times and things like that. And, and so Lloyd does that. I think Shakespeare did that a little bit differently. Charlie Chaplin, Cassavetes. I mean, I would put him very much in that same role.
But even on the musical spectrum, like Lloyd's career and like Frank Zappa, where like right at the end, Lloyd just rap production on Power Murder. and it's a very restrained black and white. It still has his stuff, kind of like Frank Zappa ended with an orchestra piece for the Yellow Shark, but it still has G-Spot Tornado in there.
Right.
But it's just a more restrained version. But throughout the whole thing, you got Don't Eat the Yellow Snow, just kind of poking you in the ribs.
No, and I mean, I think that that Zappa is a really good analogy, and was obviously somebody who really knew about music and really knew about culture and history. I mean, shoot, I was just watching this morning an old clip of Zappa, clean cut, black and white, on the Steve Allen show, wearing a suit and tie, being a good boy, cut hair, and he is showing Steve Allen how to quote unquote play the bicycle. And I'm sitting there watching this going, oh my goodness, I can't believe, again, same thing. Even back when Zappa was first getting started, he has an opportunity to be on the Steve Allen show. He's there on national television. Back in the day when that was the biggest thing that could possibly happen. Tens of millions of people are seeing him. I mean, you couldn't get bigger than that. What is he doing? He's screwing with the whole thing.
Yeah.
He's screwing around, playing the bicycle. And P.S., and especially if you know about Zappa, he's also taking it seriously. I mean, the man did do things like play the bicycle. So he's at one time like kind of making fun of Steve Allen and making fun of the Steve Allen show and the institution of that and the institution of broadcast television and the audience itself, but also was the kind of person who could and would play the bicycle, quote unquote. And that is so much Lloyd. And a little bit off topic, but kind of fun just because it's a coincidence. And he's probably listening to this too, so I got to mention him. But we're working now with the publicist Jeff Newlett. He worked with the Zappa estate, so we are actually have that connection right now. We're working with a publicist with Lloyd and the book with Zappa's old publicist in that regard. So there's a big connection there, and very much like Lloyd, Zappa could be dirty and disgusting and goofy and Wild Man Fisher and the GTOs and do all these crazy things that he did, but at the same time he can go out and fight Tipper Gore and the PMRC, and it was one of the people who helped to make sure that those albums wouldn't get censored and was fighting censorship right there with Dee Snider from Twisted Sister and John Denver, and
getting people to register to vote,
right?
And
Zappa really cared.
Like even Lloyd in his book, in the interviews, he's like, go out and vote.
Yeah, no, Lloyd definitely stands for what he believes in and talks about it. And, I can't remember the exact line, but, on the blurb on the back, it's, he's uproariously funny while also being dead serious. And I think that is who Lloyd is. And in fact, the name of the exclusive interview I have in the book here is The Clown and the Auteur, because I think that is ultimately who and what Lloyd is. And that goes right back once again to somebody like Charlie Chaplin, who understood film, who was there at the birth of film. He would compose the music for his own movies. He would write, he would direct, he would star in, he would figure out all the different camera angles and how to do everything. He would spend years on them. He would perfect them, even when it was something like, a silly fist fight or eating a shoe or cream pie fights or whatever it might be, while also making mention of things like, talking about Hitler before that was even in vogue to do. And when people still actually were, weren't fighting Hitler and that kind of thing. And, and he had to fight Hollywood about that. Like, no, this guy, like, listen to me, everyone, this guy is a bad guy. And I'm going to make an entire movie talking about that. Even when his own brother, who was Jewish, even though Chaplin wasn't, was telling him, you should just be a clown. You should just be funny. Don't talk about Hitler. And he's like, no, I'm going to talk about this guy well before all that stuff really started becoming more out there and whatnot. So I think that's really important. Or even his shorter films when he was first getting started in his early 20s, making fun of, immigration officers and making fun of the upper class and making fun of the bureaucracy and corporations. I mean, Modern Times is such a good example of that, where he is, making fun of that kind of factory line lifestyle, way more than even somebody like Lucille Ball with the chocolates and all that kind of stuff. She was great at that too, but Chaplin was really able to bring that all together. And this is a guy who didn't come from a privileged background and really had to be self-taught. And I think that's pretty amazing. So I would put Lloyd right up there with somebody like that. And I know it makes sense that was one of his biggest influences.
Well, Matthew, I know we could probably digress for another 3 or 4 hours.
Oh yeah,
and just keep going.
I wrote a whole book about it.
and honestly, it was one of my favorite reads. I put it right up there with the All I Need to Know About Filmmaking as one of the best books that is about Lloyd out there. So I really appreciate you writing this book. And when does it come out?
February 17th.
February 17th. And can people follow you on the socials?
No, I grew up in Southern California at the same time as a lot of that stuff first started coming out, and a lot of my friends were involved early on in the Facebook and things of that nature. And I remember saying, this doesn't sound right, especially having grown up on Twilight Zone and Ray Bradbury and Aldous Huxley and Orwell and Upton Sinclair and those kinds of people. I was like, we've been here before in Terminator. We've been here before. I don't like where this is going, and just certain other aspects of it over the years. So I understand a lot of people have to use social media. Lloyd does, you guys do, other people do. I never would tell anybody not to do it, but it's just never been something that I've been into. I do use LinkedIn, but just for some business stuff. I have a website, though, that people can look me up on. Got to do something, unfortunately. Got to be out there somewhere in the digital world. So it's www.mathewklickstein.com. Yes, Mathew with one T. Sorry, it's how my name is spelled legally, professionally, and on my birth certificate. Klickstein.com. And you can find the book. I'd like to say it'll be at every bookstore or whatever, what bookstores are left. Since it is the University Press, they're, a little limited in resources. So I don't know exactly where it'll be, but you can order it at your local bookstore. You can obviously get it online. I always tell people, please, support your local bookstores, support your local comic book shops. But then still give me a review on Amazon, because we need to screw with the recommendation algorithm on Amazon. The more reviews you get, the more the algorithm pushes your book. So still do that, but buy your book at your local bookstore, at your local comic book shop. And I do know, especially locally, because we're going to be doing some events and things around here, that a lot of comic book shops will have this in their stores. And I even told University Press Mississippi, please reach out to comic book shops, because Lloyd's obviously and Troma's obviously very comic book adjacent. So, and it'll be out in paperback, hardcover, and ebook edition.
If you look at our stuff, we're definitely going to be posting more about the local Troma happenings that Mathew has going on here in Colorado, because there are definitely some good ones. And you have a few others like planned elsewhere as well.
Yeah, if that is something that we're putting together now. As I said, we have a publicist now. He's a great publicist. We definitely have a lot of events that are going to be happening in Colorado. If you're out here, especially in Boulder and Fort Collins, and we're putting together something in Chicago right now that should be pretty big.
Thank you for coming on, and everybody else out there, stay traumatized.
Talkin' Trauma with Zach Bynes is hosted and produced by Zach Bynes, with assistance from Chris Lanfear and additional research by Chaz Kangas. The show is recorded at Loudspeaker Studios in Fort Collins, Colorado. Executive producers for Loudspeaker are Chris Lanfear and Charles Joseph Kelly, and our theme music is by J57 and Bald Halfwit. Talkin' Trauma is a listener-supported production of Loudspeaker Studios, a non-profit public radio service. To support the show, please consider making a donation at loudspeaker.org. Catch new episodes of the show Thursdays at 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific, streaming at loudspeaker.org and the Loudspeaker mobile app. Past episodes of the show can be found at talkintrauma.com, and you can find us on social media at Talkin' Trauma. Thanks for listening, and stay traumatized.
This has been a listener-supported production of Loudspeaker Studios. For more on this and other programs, visit loudspeaker.org.